right now on Matter of Fact. She was the only woman on the Watergate trial team, reviewing the Nixon tapes.
It's pretty dramatic to hear the voice.
So, what if President Trump taped his conversations with James Comey?
I would love to hear them.
Hear what she says about investigating a president. Plus, a new civil war over taking down the symbols of the Confederacy.
I think there's a distinction between history and historical propaganda.
What do you think? And
who is this young woman?
Wonder Woman breaks another glass ceiling. Find out why some theaters are hosting this film for women only.
You will soon find out.
I'm Soledad O'Brien. Welcome to Matter of Fact. A week of lawyering up at the White House as President Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, hired private attorneys to represent them in the Russia probe. It's all because of expanding investigations by special counsel Robert Mueller and the widening congressional probes into Russia's involvement in the 2016 election. The biggest developments of the week, special counsel Mueller cleared former FBI Director James Comey's appearance before a congressional committee. Former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn was subpoenaed by both congressional intelligence committees, as was Trump's longtime personal lawyer, Michael Cohen. So, is the scope of the investigation reaching Watergate proportions or beyond? Jill Wine-Banks was an assistant special prosecutor in the Watergate investigation. It's so nice to have you joining us. When you were on the Watergate team, there are plenty of people who were citizens who said this is a witch hunt. And that was certainly pushed by those who supported President Nixon. Similar things happen, I think, around President Trump. There are plenty of people, including President Trump himself, who said this is a witch hunt. What would you say to them?
It isn't a witch hunt. Not only is there a lot of smoke and a lot of accusations that demand to be investigated, we know that the Russians hacked the election. We know that it impacted the election. And we don't know whether they had any help from Americans, and if so, who?
What do you think are the most valuable things that come out of the special counsel's investigation? What is he looking for right now?
The special counsel is looking backward. He's looking at existing laws, federal laws, and whether they have been violated and by whom. The public will never hear anything from that investigation unless there is an indictment for criminal charges. That's when you would know something. Otherwise, it's protected by grand jury secrecy and should never be leaked or revealed. And I think it's very important in this instance for the public to have transparency right now. And a House or Senate committee that has public hearings, much like the Ervin Committee did during Watergate, provides that purpose. And they would be looking forward. Are there laws that we ought to put in place to prevent future actions?
Does the Mueller investigation and then the congressional investigations, do they interfere with each other? I mean, in any way, is one blocking the other?
They need to coordinate. If the Senate, for example, wanted to immunize someone to get their testimony, who the special counsel was looking at as a target for prosecution, that would be a problem. And so they need to coordinate that sort of activity.
Do you think that this leads to impeachment? Is that the path that we're on? 2 weeks ago, you didn't think so.
Right now, all I can do is judge what I've read in the newspapers, what I've seen on television. And when you see this much smoke and this much circumstantial evidence, and assuming that all these things are actually true, it could lead to impeachment.
What are the things that are huge red flags as being the biggest problems potentially for Donald Trump?
We can start with possibly the most obvious, which is obstruction of justice, which is a federal crime. You do need intent to obstruct justice, but if you ask the Attorney General to leave the room so you can have a private conversation during which, and I'm assuming that the memo actually exists and that Comey will next week testify, that he was asked to drop the Flynn investigation. And if you know that it's improper to discuss an ongoing investigation, then that's obstruction of justice. That's enough evidence there.
In the Watergate case, you had the tapes. There was the smoking gun. Yes. What would be the smoking gun in this particular investigation, the Mueller investigation, would that, I mean, if Comey is taking notes, does that rise to the same level as a smoking gun?
It can be, because he's a trained person who takes contemporaneous notes, and they would be pretty credible. It's not as powerful as hearing the voice of Richard Nixon and Haldeman, his chief of staff. There's no substitute for that. But it's pretty close. And remember, the president threatened that there are tapes. So maybe there are. I would love to hear them. That would be very, very exciting. So I'm waiting to see what accumulation of evidence, this drip, drip, drip of pieces of fact. And facts matter.
Jill Wine-Banks, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me here.
Next on Matter of Fact.
I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris.
The president pulls out of the Paris Accord.
So, pulling out, what does that mean?
Find out how the decision could affect you. And later,
Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, and my school refused to put the flag at half-staff.
what are the lessons of history?
It's news some would call a decision heard around the world. President Trump, who's previously called global warming a hoax, announces his decision on U.S. participation in the Paris Climate Agreement.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
Just what are we leaving behind? The Paris Agreement is a global pact to fight climate change backed by nearly 200 countries. Its goal is to limit planetary warming by slashing carbon dioxide and other emissions. It includes a U.S. pledge to significantly reduce emissions by 2025. Hundreds of American businesses oppose withdrawal. Chevron and ExxonMobil, Microsoft, Apple, Starbucks, The Gap, and others argue the agreement generates jobs, limits environmental damage, and keeps America's place in the global stage. Sarah Ladislaw is director of the Energy and National Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in D.C. She was at the U.S. Energy Department during the George W. Bush administration. It's nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
I mentioned that there are hundreds of businesses that are, and also even people within President Trump's own group who are against what he has said very often, that he does not believe in climate change, that he says sort of versions of give me a break about it, or China's manipulating it, essentially. How unusual is that these businesses are actually taking the lead in something of this magnitude on a global stage?
I think that one of the things you find is really interesting is now government companies have said, no, we actually think the long-term trend in the global economy is towards lower carbon energy, and we don't want to be confused about that. We want some clear signals so that we can prepare for that future, and it's part of their strategies.
Any withdrawal is really a 2019 withdrawal.
Yeah, so I think that's an often missed point. I'm glad you brought it up, which is that the president can signal whatever they want right now, but the fact of the matter is in the agreement, it takes a long time to execute on that withdrawal. And I think that that's actually a good thing. It could give people some time to continue this conversation, long past a decision or counter-decision or whatever the case might be is made, to really consider whether or not actually pulling out of the agreement is in the long-term interest of the United States.
If the U.S. loses the seat at the table or walks away fully from the seat at the table, can others just step up and do it without the U.S.?
I think if the U.S. does pull back, the agreement, the effectiveness of the agreement, which goal is to limit emissions, to prepare the world for a changing climate, to move financing to countries for which, climate change is actually an existential threat, right? That those efforts will be harmed without U.S. leadership at the table.
We also lose, we being the United States, also lose the opportunity for some of these green jobs that are going to be created.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about economic leadership, most of the countries around the world are trying to skate to where the puck is, not, be protectionist about their economies and try and hold things the way that they used to be. I think that there's an idea that because there is sort of real social and economic mobility issues in this country, and that this administration is trying to speak to them, that you have to do that by sort of rolling back the clock and bringing back industries that just aren't as competitive as they once were. When in point of fact, the United States has huge advantages when it comes to a whole bunch of different things, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's storage, whether it's the data that will feed into these new energy economies. So I think that we really do need to think about, what the agreement actually brings to the table in creating competitive advantages for the United States, while, oh, by the way, doing something that's really important, like dealing with climate change.
Sarah Ladislas, nice to have you.
Thank you very much. Nice to talk to you.
Next on Matter of Fact, growing up among Confederate heroes.
When I was a kid, I kind of wondered if, General Lee had died just a year or two before I was born.
How do we tell Civil War history without honoring a history of hate? And later, backlash over Wonder Woman. Is girl power getting a bad rap?
How can a woman possibly fight in this?
Fight?
The famous Battle of Appomattox Courthouse marked the defeat of the Confederacy in 1865, but their place in history lives on. The city of New Orleans just took down a massive statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, the last of 4 Confederate monuments removed after the city council declared them a public nuisance. In a speech that went viral, Mayor Mitch Landrieu defended the action, saying there's a difference between remembrance of history and reverence of it. Correspondent Diane Roberts looks at how the controversy playing out in New Orleans is reverberating in state houses and cities across America.
Renewed interest in Confederate symbols began 2 years ago after avowed white supremacist Dylan Roof shot and killed 9 African-American parishioners at a historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina. 1 month after the attack, the state Confederate battle flag was removed from the South Carolina Capitol grounds. The issue is intense because many fear their Southern history is being removed. Others say the symbols of slavery are too painful to witness. Last month, New Orleans removed a statue of Robert E. Lee, the last of 4 Confederate monuments taken down in the Crescent City. During a recent speech, Mayor Mitch Landrieu pointed out these statues tell only part of history.
These monuments celebrate a fictional sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, ignoring the terror that it actually stood for.
What some call the struggle between heritage and hate stretches beyond New Orleans. Recently, vandals struck a St. Louis monument honoring Confederate soldiers and sailors. The city's mayor wants a removal plan for that statue by the end of June. Residents of Brandenburg, Kentucky celebrated their new Confederate Soldiers of the American War statue. It's the same statue removed from the University of Kentucky 6 months earlier. Southern heritage also stands in Baltimore, where the city is considering the removal of its Confederate statues, following in the footsteps of New Orleans. For Matter of Fact, I'm Diane Roberts.
Garrett Epps is a writer, lawyer, and teacher who grew up in Richmond, Virginia. He says the veneration of the Confederacy marked his youth, and it's time to take the statues down. Nice to see you, sir.
Great to be here.
So Richmond, Virginia, the second capital of the Confederacy. What was your childhood like in terms of those statues? Were they pointed out? Was it a big deal, or was it something that people didn't even notice and they just walked by every day?
Well, you have to understand that for most of my childhood, I lived a block and a half from the equestrian statue of Lee, that is the sort of center of Monument Avenue. And everywhere we went, we were going past Confederate generals, General Stuart, General Lee, General Jackson. The school I went to, you were divided into 2 teams. You were either one of the Lees or you were one of the Jacksons. Our school colors were red and gray. Those were the 2 colors of the Confederate Army. So the Confederacy was in the room with us.
When I, as a Northeasterner, when I would ask people about Confederate statues or even the Confederate flag, they say, listen, this is our family's legacy and our family's history.
I think that's absolutely right. The Confederate statues are the product of a very particular time in Southern history, not of the post-war era, but of a generation or 2 later, when the system that we came to call segregation was being put in place.
If they're not about honoring Civil War heroes, what are they statues to? I'm asking.
They're statues to an imagined South that was all white, an imagined South in which the war was not fought for slavery; it was fought for some notion of freedom that was never quite explained.
So, like a white supremacy
exactly.
statue.
They were the symbols of white supremacy.
Was there a time when things shifted for you and you realized that these things that you had been sort of fed your entire childhood were propaganda, essentially?
I turned 18 just a few days after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And my school that I attended and some of the institutions in my neighborhood refused to put the flag at half-staff, even though President Johnson had ordered that be done. They said that they weren't going to do that to honor Dr. King. They didn't feel he deserved that honor. But I saw the effect that had on people, you know, who were shattered with grief because of the loss of this amazing leader, and who were being told by people in power, your grief doesn't count, your history doesn't count. We won't take the slightest account of who you were and who this man was. And to realize how hurtful that was to them, that probably turned my mind to the idea of civic imagery and how much we live by symbols.
Mr. Epps, nice to see you. Thank you for talking with us.
It's my pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Coming up next, months of protests did not stop the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Now, an online news magazine says protesters were targeted by a private security firm.
Were protesters being treated like terrorists? Plus, Wonder Woman takes on the world.
And it's what I'm going to do.
Why the movie is taking some hits online.
6 months of massive protests over the Dakota Access Pipeline did not stop its construction. As of Thursday, the 1,200-mile pipeline running from North Dakota to Illinois was fully operational. Now, an online news magazine, The Intercept, says protesters were targeted by a private security firm using aggressive counterterrorism tactics, working with local law enforcement. The website says the security firm Tiger Swan was hired by the pipeline developer Energy Transfer Partners. The Intercept released documents describing the use of military-style counterterrorism measures against what the company called an ideologically driven insurgency. The pipeline was the focus of heated protests and sometimes violent clashes last year when the Standing Rock Sioux tribe set up camp along the construction site in Cannonball, North Dakota. Nearly 200 tribes and thousands of supporters opposed a portion of the pipeline that went under the Missouri River, the main water source for the tribe. According to the Associated Press, police made 761 arrests between August and February. The tribes say the report proves police and security were essentially given permission to carry out warlike tactics against the protesters. Energy Transfer Partners, the developer, says its only concern was safety for all involved.
When we return, Wonder Woman on the big screen, with showings for women only.
Not everybody thinks this is a good idea.
What do you think?
With the recent onslaught of superhero movies, we're getting a new big-budget movie focused on a female comic book character, Wonder Woman. The movie opens this weekend, and thanks to Alamo Drafthouse Cinema, 5 theaters are hosting women-only screenings around the country. That means from the audience to the staff, only people who identify as female will get in.
You will soon find out.
They'll see the iconic Wonder Woman take a lead in fighting the war to end all wars, and along the way, discovering her full powers. The Alamo Drafthouse did make apologies to its male patrons. Their announcement says, "Apologies, gentlemen, but we are embracing our girl power and saying no guys allowed." That's not much of an apology. Not everybody thinks this is a good idea. It's generating some backlash online, like this tweet. "Yeah, sexism is great. Let's see more businesses banning on the basis of gender." Or this one, "Feminists equal hypocrites." Not everybody reacted negatively, though. There were men who sided with the theater. It's one showing out of a number of showings of a movie where women can go and see Wonder Woman. You tell me what's wrong with it. As for the theater, they're planning more female-only showings. So however you're going to see it this weekend, it's getting great reviews, so I hope you'll check it out. I'm Soledad O'Brien, and we'll see you back here next week on Matter of Fact.